It's a great honor to be here. My name is Annie Bourneuf, and I'm going to talk about the Cubist prints in particular. We are fortunate to have an extraordinary group of 23 Cubist prints by Picasso and Braque on display here, not least because this puts us in a good position to ask a very basic question. What were Picasso and Braque doing in their prints of those pivotal years of 1910 to 1912? And why were they doing what they were doing? These are truly open questions. The two artists' paintings, collages, and constructions of the same years have tended, unsurprisingly, to overshadow these prints made by utterly traditional techniques for artists' prints, dry point and etching, that is, using a needle or acid to inscribe lines on a copper plate. Indeed, at first glance, what might strike us about the prints is their apparently traditional character. Traditional not in the way the motifs, these figures and still lifes, are rendered in the prints, which is as strange as it is in Picasso's and Braque's work in other media, but traditional in the way that these prints relate to their work in other media. Compare, for instance, Picasso's oil on canvas dressing table to his etched table, both of 1910. We see that the latter repeats much of the former's composition, mirror reversed, as if not even taking account of the mirror reversal of the image on the metal plate when it is printed on paper. See how the glass right there echoes the glass right there, but pointing in an opposite direction. Same with the little keys here and there. Devices and formats are shared as well as motifs. For example, Picasso used the same stencil of the numbers 75 in his etched still life with bunch of keys as he did in two paintings done around the same time. This is one of them. You can see the 75 up there, as well as echoing the oval format he often chose for his paintings. Not only might the prints be seen as deriving from the artist's paintings, but it also seems that much of the impetus behind the prints came from their dealer, Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, which might again incline us to see the prints as merely a means of circulating and publicizing innovations first worked out elsewhere in the paintings. While both artists did a great deal of printmaking in later decades, indeed, Picasso is perhaps the most important printmaker of the 20th century, their major work is often said to begin after the Cubist years. In fact, Picasso was more engaged with printmaking at moments before and after the early 19-teens. During the years in question, neither Picasso nor Braque pursued printmaking continuously. Their sporadic involvement in printmaking is difficult to summarize, but the bare outlines might be sketched as follows. During his blue and rose periods, Picasso had worked extensively in etching and dry point, which would be the only techniques either he or Braque used in the early 19-teens. After finishing a series of prints of saltimbanques in 1905, Picasso made dry prints from time to time during the following years, but he appears to have made no prints at all after two dry points of winter 1908 to 1909 until the summer of 1910, when he began work on a commission from Kahnweiler, his dealer. Kahnweiler asked Picasso for illustrations for Max Jacobs' novel Saint-Materiel, which Kahnweiler published in 1911 as a limited edition livre d'artiste, including 4 of Picasso's etchings. In 1911 and 1912, Picasso made prints from time to time, 2 of which, Head of a Man with Pipe and Still Life with Bottle of Mark, Kahnweiler published in 1912, along with the 2 dry points of winter 1908-9, all 4 in editions of 100. Unlike Picasso, Braque had little experience in Intaglio printmaking at the beginning of their close collaboration. Most of his Cubist prints, all but 2 of which are still lifes, date from 1911 and 1912. Again, unlike Picasso, who continued to make prints intermittently in 1913 and 1914, Braque abruptly ceased printmaking altogether in 1912, the year that Kahnweiler published 2 of his dry points, this, which is Fox, and Job. Some say that it was due to their dismal sales that Braque did not make another Intaglio print until 1932, when Ambroise Vollard commissioned him to etch illustrations for Hesiod's Theogony. One basic question we might ask of these Cubist prints is this: why did Picasso and Braque, both of whom later worked in a very wide range of print processes, work so exclusively in dry point and etching during the Cubist years? If we take a quick survey of printmaking in Paris in the first decade of the 20th century, we can better situate how these prints were made. Kahnweiler's form of publishing, the commissioning of original prints and livres d'artistes by avant-garde artists known primarily as painters, was largely modeled on the example set by the dealer Ambroise Vollard, whom Kahnweiler greatly admired. But Vollard, unlike Kahnweiler, favored lithography, above all, color lithography. Indeed, Vollard played a major role in establishing color lithography as a fine art medium in the 1890s. It had previously been viewed as a commercial medium, associated both with mass-produced chromolithographs that adorned so many homes and with advertising posters in the streets. Clearly, the aesthetics of color lithography, as exemplified by Bonnard and Vuillard's prints for Vollard, could not have been further from Picasso's and Braque's interests during the Cubist years, when they avoided local color in favor of umbers, ochres, and grays. But it's more curious that neither artist worked in lithography at all, color or black and white, until after the First World War. As I mentioned, Picasso, unlike Braque, had worked extensively in dry point and etching years before his first commissions from Kahnweiler. In Picasso's first major print, The Frugal Repast, rich tonalities, carefully built up out of layers of hatching and cross-hatching, are reinforced by the printer's selective wiping of the plate. Auguste Delattre pulled 30 proofs of this etching for Picasso in 1904 at the shop he ran with his son, Eugène. The elder Delattre, one of the founders of the Société des Aquafortistes, the leading organization of the etching revival in France in the 1860s, was famous for his varied inking and wiping of the plate, self-consciously recalling the example of Rembrandt, a specialty of the shop that his son carried on after his death in 1907. Picasso continued to have his work printed at the Delattre workshop during the Cubist years. Indeed, the workshop printed all of Kahnweiler's editions of both his and Braque's plates. It is above all in the surface tone, the gray resulting from the film of ink left deliberately on the plate, that we can see the mark of the printer. In Picasso's earlier plates, such as the 2 small dry points, this one, 2 nudes, and still life with Compotier, the incised lines describe a play of light and shadow that Eugène Delattre's inking emphasizes. But both artists' later plates, such as Braque's Fox, entirely lack consistent cues that the printer might follow, so Delattre left instead a thin, even, uninflected tone over the entire surface of the plate. Some of the later prints of Braque's plates, which were done in the 1950s, and we have some of those in the exhibition, actually are darker along the periphery There's plate tone mostly around the edge, and then it becomes lighter in the center. Against the range of processes other artists preferred, such as the color lithographs of the Nabi, the woodcuts of Matisse, Vlaminck, and Derain, whose woodcuts illustrated the first livre d'artiste Kahnweiler commissioned, Apollinaire's L'Enchanteur Périsson of 1909, we can see intaglio printmaking as a choice made from a number of alternatives, opposed, broadly speaking, both to the popular and commercial associations of lithography and to the often primitivist inflection given the woodcut, the latter of which, tellingly, Picasso experimented with while working on the Demoiselles d'Avignon. Whatever Picasso and Braque thought of the revivalist aesthetics that often accompanied fine art intaglio printmaking, certainly in the Delattre workshop, even the shop's letterhead depicted a vaguely 17th century interior. This is actually a note from Eugène Delattre to Picasso. These revivalist aesthetics certainly didn't rule out these processes for the artists. So we might be tempted to fold the prints back into the Cubist oeuvre as a whole. After all, whereas most of both Picasso's and Braque's later prints constitute distinct series, many of the Cubist prints, with their close links to paintings and drawings, belong to series unconfined to a single medium. Thus, it might seem that separating them out from the rest of the artist's work to ask what they were doing in the prints in particular is a mistaken approach. But if we don't consider the prints separately, their connections to the paintings tend to place them in the ancillary role often reserved for prints, which are often understood as a mere means of dissemination. If we see the prints this way, there seems to be little about them that actually requires any explanation at all. I'm going to argue today that this view of the prints is wrong, that in fact the Cubist prints take advantage of particular conventions of printmaking to pursue concerns central to Braque's and Picasso's, but especially Picasso's, Cubist work as a whole. But because the prints do this from a position so embedded within these conventions, playing with features sedimented into intaglio printmaking over the span of both its recent and more distant history, it is difficult to make out their game, to see what resources they find in it to advance their central concerns. The prints look traditional because the way in which the artists are playing with print media is so intimately intertwined with the history of the artist's print. It may sound as if I'm interpreting the Cubist prints as above all concerned with intaglio printmaking as a medium, with comprehending its particular limits and potentialities, and thus inscribing them into a reading of Cubism as aiming towards medium specificity and formal autonomy. It may seem that this is a foregone conclusion given the way that I've framed my question, asking what Picasso and Braque were up to in their printmaking in particular. However, this is not quite what I am arguing. What I hope to suggest, rather, is that Picasso found resources within printmaking, resources specific to printmaking, that he could exploit to disruptive ends, complicating divisions between inside and outside, original and reproduction, and horizontal and vertical. I'll begin by discussing two particularly strange works by Picasso that are actually not in this exhibition, works that show particularly clearly how Picasso is at once drawing on the peculiarities of the artist's print and using those peculiarities to subversive ends. Then I'll explain three qualities of printmaking that seem to have been of great interest to Picasso and sometimes to Braque, qualities that, if we attend to them, can help us see what the artists were up to in the Cubist prints on display. I'll begin with this very strange etching, Still Life with Bunch of Keys. There exist only two proofs of it, and it seems that it was never finished as Picasso intended. For in May of 1912, Picasso wrote from the Catalonian town where he was spending part of the spring to Kahnweiler back in Paris with the following request. I still have the idea of having a name engraved on the visiting card. So you must send me one of the two proofs so that I can draw for you in the right place the letters that would have to be engraved by a professional engraver, a visiting card engraver. The words Picasso wanted to have a professional visiting card engraver inscribe on the print were Mademoiselle Léonie, Boulevard Barbès. Although Kahnweiler did indeed, after some delay, send a proof to Picasso, somehow the plan Picasso set out in his letter was never accomplished. Since the plan was not carried out, we can't be sure what the right place for the inscription of which Picasso speaks would have been. I think we can assume that it was not the traditional place for titles or other inscriptions underneath the image, framing the image but also separate from it, for then Picasso would not have needed to indicate the right place for the letters. Picasso's request implies that he must have wanted the engraver to write the letters in the loopy calligraphic script in which visiting card engravers specialized, somewhere inside the oval of this frame. One thinks of the visiting card reading Miss Gertrude Stein, which Picasso painted in the architect's table right there, which he painted earlier that year, imitating the look of engraved lettering. While a connection between the hand of the artist and the printed line defines the concept of the original artist's print, and particularly of the original etching, which is valued above all for its sensitive registration of the individuality of the hand, Picasso's idea of getting a professional engraver to do the lettering disconnects hand and line, a disconnection already begun by the stenciled 75 at the etching's upper right. Indeed, one might see Picasso's plan of hiring another hand to work on his plate as a move away from the model of the artwork as a product of the artist's skilled hand alone, a move that might be compared to some of the far more frequently discussed gambits Picasso was trying out in the spring of 1912, to his use of depersonalized techniques hitherto held distant from the realm of fine art, such as stencils and glossy commercial enamel paint. That same spring, Picasso first tried using the house decorator's technique of using a comb to simulate wood grain, which Braque had taught him, and glued printed oilcloth to canvas to make the first Cubist collage, the still life with chair caning. In fact, in the very same letter in which Picasso asked his dealer to send him a proof of bunch of keys, he also requests that his stencils for letters and numbers and his combs for making fake wood grain be sent to him as well. We might see Picasso's use of the same stencil of the number 75 in the etching, as in paintings done around the same time, as signaling the intimate connection between the etching and these means of de-skilling painting. But actually hiring an artisan to work on the plate might be seen as going still farther than the artist's use of artisans' tools. One might compare Picasso's plan to what Marcel Duchamp did for his farewell to painting, the canvas of 1918 that includes a fastidious painting of a pointed hand right there, executed not by Duchamp himself, but by a sign painter that Duchamp hired. And yet, at the same time, Picasso's plan might be seen not as pointing forward to Duchamp's last painting, but as referring back to traditional divisions of labor within printmaking. For it was the norm in 18th and 19th century print publishing for lettering on a print, the print's title, for example, to be the work of a specialist writing engraver. Such divisions of labor among designer, engraver, or engravers, printer, and publisher were part of the ordinary way of producing prints. Now, my best guess, I want to emphasize that this is a guess, is that the right place for the lettering that Picasso mentions might be the rectangle almost touching the oval's edge right over here. See the frame, which lies flat and seems to allude, with the curved line inscribed within it, to the format of the etching as a whole, an oval set inside a rectangle. And thus Picasso might be making an analogy between his artist's etching and the larger category of everyday printed matter, such as the visiting cards that were the ordinary stock in trade of a writing engraver. This is quite different from what we see in the architect's table, where the visiting card tilts away from the surface, and there isn't the same kind of equivalency suggested between the overall painting and the visiting card imaged within it. One might see another reference to traditions of printmaking, not so much what one might see as the technical givens of a medium, but the sort of things that the print trade did, in the particular words that Picasso wished for the visiting card engraver to write. Mademoiselle Léonie was a character in Saint-Materiel, the novel written by Picasso's friend Max Jacob, which, as I mentioned earlier, Kahnweiler had published the previous year as an artist's book accompanied by Picasso's etchings. The allusion to the fictional character, the mistress of the novel's protagonist, Victor Maturel, a Métro employee who converts to Catholicism after a mystical experience, on the visiting card, is in part one of Picasso's many coded in-jokes to his friends. But it might also be seen as a reference to the printed picture's frequent role as illustration, its frequent place within the printed book. This etching doesn't illustrate Jacob's novel. Indeed, even Picasso's prints that were placed in the novel do not function as illustrations in any ordinary sense, bearing little clear and specific visual connection to the text. The titles given to Picasso's Saint-Materiel prints assert a connection between the etchings and the wild imaginings of Jacob's text. For instance, this etching in the middle is titled Mademoiselle Léonie seated on a chaise longue, but rather little in those images themselves reinforces that connection. In the Bunch of Keys etching made after the publication of the illustrated book, it seems that Picasso experiments with the notion of lodging the title, the name that makes the connection between printed image and printed text, visibly within the image on a depicted visiting card. If we ordinarily conceive of the inscription on a print as serving a role akin to the frame of a painting, not quite part of the print proper, but presenting it to the world, usually the work of another hand, mediating between what is inside and what is outside the image, we can see Picasso here as taking something that is ordinarily on the outside of the picture and putting it inside the picture. This is, I think, closely related to what Christine Poggi has argued so persuasively about Picasso's play with frames and framing. If the frame of a picture, she has written, works to mark the boundary between the fiction within the frame from the reality beyond it, in order to establish the picture as unified, coherent, and autonomous, putting that frame inside the picture represents a subversion of prevailing notions of artistic unity. Now, for whatever reason, Picasso's plan was never, in fact, carried out. No professional engraver ever did anything with the plate. But the unfinished etching and the proposal in the letter to Kahnweiler together are enough, I think, to suggest that we might see in the Cubist prints not only a means for the artists and their dealer to disseminate some of the innovations of Cubist painting and drawing, but a place where Picasso subtly exploited the particular conventions of making and looking at prints in ways nevertheless related to the aims of his work in other media, as, for instance, the project of hiring a professional engraver relates to the Cubist use of rippling or collage. The bunch of keys etching suggests one kind of subversive play with and by means of traditional features of the Intaglio print. I'll deduce another very different example to help us see another way that Picasso plays with the Intaglio print. In 1913, Picasso made a construction of wood, newspaper, and paint representing a guitar and bottle of Bass. Kahnweiler had the construction photographed, and this photograph was then published in the November 1913 issue of Les Soirées de Paris. Picasso then took the half-tone block used to print the photograph in the magazine and set about reworking it, using the intaglio techniques to which he was accustomed. Although the copper surface of a photomechanical half-tone block may be scratched by a needle or bitten by acid in the usual manner, such a block is not made to be printed in the same way as an intaglio plate. The ink is pressed into the incised lines of the latter, but spread onto the raised surfaces of the former. Thus, when Picasso prints the half-tone with his hand press, the tones are reversed, as in a photographic negative. The dark plane on which the bottle of Bass rests in the original photograph becomes the white field upon which Picasso first intervenes, making the bottle cast a shadow. See, he went in with a needle to get that shadow there, which is not present there. A patch of parallel lines. He brings the print through 7 states: scratching, scraping, and etching, adding new shadows and planes, punching up the contrast, pivoting the guitar around its sound hole, introducing a tenora, and scratching out the photo credit line at the bottom of the block. We used to say cliche Kahnweiler right there. That scored out credit line provides the artist the print's customary title, cliche Kahnweiler. And Baldassari has argued that Picasso's reworking of the halftone is part of what might be seen as a series of transformations across various media, extending from Picasso's 1913 construction with guitar player through Picasso's photographs of that assemblage and the guitar and bottle of Bass construction as Kahnweiler photographed it, to the alteration of the halftone block and the woodcut that Picasso made out of the block's wooden support, all of which Baldassari sees the reworked version of the guitar and bottle of Bass, the construction as it exists today, as summing up. Picasso often worked in a series across media in this way, carrying transformations accomplished in one medium into another, allowing further transformations. The cliche Kahnweiler emblematizes this way of working, taking advantage of the photograph's flattening of the wooden sculpture's relief and the hand press's reversal of the halftone's tones. The proofs Picasso pulled as he reconfigured the halftone make up a step-by-step record of his alterations, suggesting that the very process of transformation is itself a central concern here. The cliche Kahnweiler seems to play on the difference between the rendering of intermediate tones in halftones as opposed to intaglio prints. The simulation of continuous tone by means of dots in the former, as opposed to the parallel lines and cross-hatching that the latter's linearity entails. In the later states of the print, the area of the halftone that best displays the shadowy transitions of the photomechanical process, the fretted neck of the guitar in the construction, no longer seems to denote the neck of the guitar, which has now a new neck to the old one's left. The old neck, however, has not been scraped or scratched out, but rather partially overlaid with parallel lines, spaced far enough apart that we can make out underneath them the other photomechanical kind of shading. An area to the upper left of the halftone, over here, has been left unaltered, so that the intermediate grays of the photographed wood grain in the construction are preserved to contrast with the black lines scratched and bitten into the copper. From the outset, the cliche Kahnweiler complicates the relation between an artwork and its reproduction. Both the construction and the halftone block underwent major and different changes after the magazine came out. The altered construction and the altered photomechanical reproduction permute and vary rather than precisely mirror each other. But the addition of the tenora, that's this wind instrument right here, to both the construction and the block after the photograph was taken. You can see that in the original photograph, there's no tenora. Suggests that Picasso wanted to play with, rather than to sever, the relation between these two by adding a tenora to each, although different tenoras and positioned differently. If the cliche Kahnweiler seems concerned with this relation between a work and its reproduction, and most of all with the perversion of this relation, it is important to note that this play is accomplished by bringing together on one surface photomechanical reproduction and manual intaglio techniques. It is by no means easy to etch a halftone block. The acid tends to leak between the points of the halftone raster. One might well ask why Picasso nevertheless worked on the plate rather than, for instance, drawing on a print pulled from the block. Here it might be relevant to consider how Kahnweiler and Picasso together used both photography and intaglio printmaking to circulate Picasso's work during the Cubist years, but in different ways. Kahnweiler photographed everything he acquired from Picasso, and these photographs served as an indispensable reference for Kahnweiler, for visitors to his gallery, and for Picasso himself, who asked Kahnweiler to send him copies of these photos, not only as an aide-mémoire, but also as a defamiliarizing transformation of his own work. Published photographs, such as the photos of constructions published in Les Soirées de Paris, played an absolutely crucial role in disseminating Picasso's work. Etching and dry point might be seen as another but very different way of disseminating Picasso's work. John Richardson argues that part of the impetus of Kahnweiler's print and book editions was his wish to provide something affordable for collectors of advanced taste and modest means, such as the patrons of the little contemporary galleries opening up in Germany, supporting a strategy of cultivating Central European markets for his artists. The concept of the original print undergirding Kahnweiler's publishing ventures took on sharper definition only in the second half of the 19th century. It was defined by the direct work of the artist on the copper plate, lithographic stone, or other matrix, and opposed to the division of labor characterizing reproductive engraving, such as this, between the artist who invents a design or paints a painting and the professional printmaker who translates it onto a matrix. Such original prints were defined with increasing vehemence against a range of other multiples, from reproductive chromolithographs to photographs. Kahnweiler's publication of Picasso's etchings and dry points took place very much within the framework developed in Paris in the second half of the 19th century for the production of limited edition original prints for a collector's market. Here too we see the collaboration between a dealer-publisher, an artist, and a printer specializing in working with artists and in the low-volume, labor-intensive work such editions involve. In the cliche Kahnweiler, Picasso superimposes two modes of making multiples that were, in a sense, complementary. One might, in general terms, see the use of reproductive engraving to circulate and disseminate artworks deeply embedded in the French academic system as upset by a number of forces in the mid-19th century, including the reproductive use of photography and the aesthetic value assigned to the original print, institutionalized more effectively and argued more fiercely, beginning with the so-called etching revival of the 1860s. Charles Baudelaire, for instance, praised the original etching, above all, as peculiarly expressive of the artist's personality. Although we can thus see photography and the original print as two complementary parts of a modern system of reproduction that supplants reproductive engraving, the two media also exclude each other. The half-tone photograph is an example of the kind of mass-produced, impersonal image in contrast to which the original print proposed itself as original. Part of the subversive play of the cliche Kahnweiler might be seen as its combination of these two techniques, reciprocal but opposed, in which both original print and photographic reproduction lose the qualities for which they were originally valued. Each was prized for its apparent immediacy, the direct work of the artist's hand in the case of the former, the direct imprint of reality in the case of the latter. But these immediacies are incompatible with one another, so that their combination appears as strange and paradoxical, an image that qualifies itself. Looking closely at the bunch of keys and cliche Kahnweiler can help alert us to the disruptive potential that Picasso derived from playing with and against the particular qualities and traditions of Intaglio printmaking. Now I want to zoom out a little to talk more broadly about three features of the Intaglio print that seem to have particularly attracted Picasso's attention, and sometimes Braque's, in many of the Cubist prints: the means of rendering tone in the linear terms of etching and dry point, the possibilities of step-by-step variation over a number of states, and the intimate mode of viewing that prints often invite, distinct from the kind of looking that painting solicits. I'll explain these features one by one. Braque based his very first print, the dry point nude, on a drawing of almost the same size, but reversed. One of the most striking differences between the drawing and the print is that while the contours of the drawing of the nude figure are modeled rather simply, the dry point is traversed from upper left to lower right by dark areas of a whole gamut of the conventionalized means of rendering tonality in the linear terms of Intaglio printmaking, lines of different weights, from thin to richly burred, hatching and cross-hatching running in different directions, short stippled lines, the double lines produced by a double-tipped tool. This band of tone, variously wrought, seems to exceed any interest in modeling the figure. One might well say that in his first print, Braque was testing out the range of effects he could produce, but he continued to work in this way. Examine, for instance, the varied modes of repetitive mark making in Bass, ranging from the central area, where the perpendicular cross-hatching is carried out on a scale where it reads as a pattern rather than as tone, to the etched version of fake wood in the upper right-hand corner, over there, to hatched areas shading the table edge at the bottom of the sheet. It seems that in part it was the very conventionality of the vocabulary of patterned marks developed and systematized by Intaglio printmakers to denote tone and model three-dimensional form that interested both artists. If we compare the two large dry points Kahnweiler published, Picasso's Still Life with Bottle of Mark and Braque's Fox, we can see that both artists used an array of flicks, parallel lines, and cross-hatching, curved and straight in various directions. The flicks in particular seem both to play on a convention deeply embedded in the history of intaglio printmaking and at the same time to work to translate, as it were, the systematized brushstrokes that both artists used in their paintings at that time, and that Picasso, referring to his young girl with an accordion, 1911, called Signac-style methodical facture in a letter to Braque in that same summer of 1911 that the dry points were made. Both the regular strokes that Picasso designates with this phrase and the phrase itself suggest an interest in the coded, the systematic, and demonstrably artificial in painting. It appears that a parallel interest in the elaborateness of the conventional means of representing tonality in intaglio printmaking played a role in its particular appeal for Picasso and Braque. The second feature is the possibilities of permutation and variation afforded by printmaking. Picasso often brought a print through a number of states, viewing the successive transformation of a plate through the series of proofs pulled from intermediate stages of work, as he did with the cliche Kahnweiler. The artistic exploitation of multiple states is most associated with intaglio printmaking. The many states through which Rembrandt took his etchings is the canonical example, drawn upon by Degas and many others in the late 19th century. It's very likely that Picasso's interest in working in this way was a major factor in his acquisition of his own hand press in 1907, allowing him to pull his own proofs as he worked on a plate. For instance, Mademoiselle Léonie sur une chaise longue, one of his Saint-Material illustrations, was thoroughly transformed between the first state, depicting a standing Léonie facing forward, head turned to the right, and the last, in which she appears not only elaborated but much changed, perched askew in the chaise longue and head turned to the left. It seems that this possibility of serial transformation through a number of intermediate states, each of which may be preserved as a proof, was one of the medium's most important capacities for Picasso, a capacity that must be understood as at once technical and historical. There is an important distinction to be drawn here between Picasso's and Braque's Cubist prints. Unlike Picasso, it appears that Braque did not rework his plates through series of states. This possibility of intaglio printmaking did not interest him, it seems, and this may be one of the reasons why intaglio printmaking appears to have engaged him much less consistently than it did Picasso. For Picasso, it seems, the sheer multiplicity of the print seems to have made it an excellent basis for permutation, variation. For instance, we have on display here 2 prints of Picasso's Head of a Man with a Pipe, which Kahnweiler published in an edition of 100, and Picasso signed one of them right side up and the other one upside down. There's his signature there. The third suggestion I have to make regarding what it was about intaglio printmaking that might have interested Picasso and Braque in the early 19-teens, and how these interests might relate to their work in other media, is more speculative. To return to the bunch of keys, Picasso's plan of hiring an engraver to work directly on his plate, particularly on that rectangle that seems to echo in miniature the shape of the print as a whole, draws a comparison between the print as a whole and a visiting card. One of the shared characteristics that such a comparison brings out is that both prints and visiting cards are often held in the hand. Peter Parshall has recently emphasized the particular ways late 19th century viewers related to certain kinds of original prints, how much the mode of encounter between object and beholder implied by such prints differs from that between, say, a spectator standing before a painting hanging on a wall, even in bodily terms. The intimacy that comes from holding a work of art in the hand writes Partial, is an experience particular, but not peculiar to prints, which must be singled out from its portfolio and tilted to the light, much as a book is pulled from a library shelf. As we can see, even in Henry Somm's advertisement for the Delattre workshop, showing a fashionably dressed woman, creator or consumer of the print she holds in her hands, the notion of the print as a handheld object was pervasive. Jean Laude gives the following description of the peculiar kind of encounter between viewer and painting that he suggests Picasso's and Braque's Cubist paintings solicit. Everything, he writes, occurs as if the gaze, focusing on a painting by Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso, has to become other. Their pictures are of restricted dimensions. They can be held between the hands and seen otherwise than hung on a wall. They do not essentially aim at changing the space they occupy. As a result, the viewer can, if such is desired, have direct contact with them, analogous to that one has with a book. Metaphorically, the viewer reads a painting which cannot be absorbed at one go. It must be explored in every direction in order to detect and enrich the interrelations. Perhaps we might see the relation between viewer and print as offering one model of the kind of looking that Laude evokes. Now, much discussion of Cubism has seen it as accomplishing what Yves Lambois, speaking of the still life with chair caning, made in the same month as the bunch of keys, has called a 90-degree pivoting of the implied orientation of the picture, the way the picture relates to the body of the viewer. As Bois writes, the vertical address of painting, hung on a wall and conceived since the Renaissance as a vertically oriented window onto the world, was always opposed to the horizontal and diagrammatic space of writing. With few exceptions, man reads seated at a table, especially since the invention of printing. If Cubism remakes painting into something almost like writing, a matter of signs rather than illusion, inviting the viewer to read them, we see in chair caning that this way of making painting horizontal is allied to another. The oval shape of the canvas asks to be read as the horizontal plane of a cafe table, flipping the implied plane of painting from the vertical to the horizontal. And yet, as Christine Poggi has pointed out, Parisian cafe tables are usually round. Thus, the horizontal oval format of bunch of keys and of still life with chair caning is ambiguous and suggests that the still life is not to be understood as purely horizontal, nor as purely vertical in its orientation, but rather as a tabletop as viewed obliquely at a little distance. This print, also a horizontal oval, might perhaps be seen as intervening in this problematic of the horizontal and the vertical, instantiating a kind of oblique viewing, mediating between the way a viewer looks at a page of text on the one hand and at a painted picture on the other. Indeed, prints in general might be understood to fall somewhere in between the complete arbitrariness of the written sign and the horizontality of the page of text on the one hand, and on the other, the illusionism of oil painting and its vertical address to the viewer. Prints might be seen as offering a model for such oblique viewing, as we might also see the horizontal oval format of chair caning as implying in another way. Bunch of keys could be seen as an experiment in taking advantage of the print as a model for such oblique viewing. Thank you.
I really want to thank you for a fascinating and interesting talk. I think that prints and drawings kind of get short shrift, especially in conferences and stuff. So, and actually in shows as well. And I think that's one of the strengths of the exhibition, to have the prints kind of integrated with these images. And your talk kind of brings that, the importance and the kind of dialoguing that's going on into full view. And I think it's really, it's fascinating. So thank you. I was so struck, actually, and I don't know, I guess I can't separate all of these talks from one another. They kind of, as I said, they sort of start interlocking. But one of the things that was interesting to me was to think about the carte de visite as, the visiting card, as actually the thing that takes the place of the person. And so, so it sort of stands in as an abstraction for the person. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that in relation, say, to printmaking or to the kind of these two readings that you were. I keep thinking of Granville, who did a lithograph of persons represented by their accoutrements. I don't know if you know that, when all these figures are formed out of umbrellas and particular hats and stuff, and there's no actual figures in them. So I was thinking that kind of abstraction of the carte de visite is something that I found really striking, especially when we were talking about bodies earlier. So,
I mean, that's a really fascinating way to think of the still life with a bunch of keys, which on the one hand seems to be thinking about the absence of someone. I don't know, there's something about the visiting card and the bunch of keys. It's like these sort of leftover belongings of an implied presence, and that seems to, in some respect, parallel what he seems to be experimenting with in terms of his own absence from at least moments of mark making here, which he doesn't actually end up doing. I mean, another absence in this etching is that, in fact, his plan of bringing in this professional visiting card engraver never happened. So a lot of absences going on in there.
Yeah, and I think also that idea of the card being held in your hand as an indicator that somebody has been there, or that they've, left it, and having it in the image as well as a kind of sign signifier. That whole play kind of brings all of these kinds of things together that we've been talking about. I also, let me see here in my notes. And of course, I think one of the really great things that you pointed out was the fact that the print kind of allows this kind of permutation, transformation, which is something that Picasso also did in his drawings. But I love the idea of him taking something, this is kind of like, where are the people who've thought about the age of art and art and the age of mechanical reproduction? Suddenly you have a thing that can be reproduced in the hand of the artist, the aura of the artist is removed, but at the same time, he takes that, Picasso just takes that object, which is mechanically reproduced, and sort of like retools it as his own.
Yeah, I think that, perhaps the way that he comes back and alters that copper halftone plate might be seen as some sort of reassertion of presence into what might have seemed an absence.
Yeah, and also that the mechanical doesn't get the last word. Picasso always has to have the last word in some way, and of course it has to be hard, like it's got to be a print that's impossible to etch, and is really difficult, so that, that sort of, it's almost like a battle between, the surface and the substance, the materiality, and then this kind of conceptual and physical that I think is talked a lot about in terms of the paintings, but not actually really thought about in the actual physicality of making a print.
Yeah, and that it's a matter of actually erasing and scoring out and making making the parts of the print that would have seemed to have not been Picasso's own, like the credit line, then become the sort of particular object over which he works and underscores and erases.
Right, absolutely. And back to the frame, right? And the frame that actually, in some ways, is, and the identification, the fixing of things. I mean, I wondered actually about the abandonment of the project of putting in the name. I wondered if, that fixed things too much for Picasso, but that idea continued to play, in these other sorts of prints. That it might have been actually, not just by accident that it didn't happen, but, of course, that he just sort of decided no, because keeping all these things in play, as soon as you actually turn it into writing, and those signs really do connect to things, it sort of pulls apart the kind of indeterminacy of the Cubist project. Yeah. I was also thinking about the keys as things that are keys. There's a kind of play on that game of, the key will unlock the story, and these keys, they're all messed up. They're there, but at the same time, they're clearly not going to give anything away. So I found that so interesting. And also they're metal objects, like the object that, burn or what you would use to etch the plate. So I'm probably confusing all my terms. I'm really bad with prints. And
I've also been wondering whether perhaps one of the reasons why he didn't actually get a visiting card engraver to work on this plate is perhaps, in a way, this oblique viewing that seems to be figured by this print, this sort of suggestion of the print as a middle ground between the horizontal and the vertical. Perhaps that mediated the conflict between horizontal and vertical too much. Maybe it
right.
seemed to be a sort of a false resolution or something that would sort of dampen down the conflict in a way that
right.
Picasso did not want.
Right, no key, right? It gives it away. It's like too easy, And that's why I think your presentation was great, because it kind of like unfolded that thought process. Kind of, it's in the background of this, and that idea. Actually, I'm always struck by the fact that prints have such tactility on some level, but I'd not really thought about it as the thing that you hold and on the one hand read, but also view. I thought it was a really interesting kind of twist on what Bois has suggested. I don't have a lot of questions for you, I'm sorry. I just thought that it was really interesting, and I'm thinking about images in different ways. Yeah, please, Chris.
Hi, I thought that was really fascinating. I guess I'm kind of sorry he didn't get it engraved, so I'm just curious as to how, I just would love to see it. I'm almost wondering if it wasn't because maybe the engraver would have written the whole thing out as requested, and Picasso likes to fragment things, and I don't know. But I'm also wondering what you think of, I can't really make it out. It looks like there's writing in the middle. Maybe I'm wrong. Is that? And so I was just wondering about these different kinds of mark making. I can't see what that says, and I'm not terribly familiar with this print.
Yeah. There's an image of a hand, actually. It's like, it says POI. POI right there. This sort of cross-like hand thing. This image has also been called "Still Life in a Barber Shop" because it's been thought that this is a label that's a sort of fragmentary label for some kind of a skin cream or like a shaving lotion.
Shaving lotion or soap, yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. So then that was just interesting to me because from what, so if that is a commercial lettering, that would have been a label, but it looks like it's hand drawn. Then you have the variation of somebody mimicking a label but in a hand done mode. And then you've got the stencil, which is yet a different kind of lettering. And then you would have had the engraving. So I think there does seem to be, whether it was stopped deliberately or not, doesn't seem to be clear, but this real reflection on different kinds of lettering that would apply to different processes and different cultural codes and different parts of social life. So to know that this might be in a barbershop is also interesting. So I just think that's really interesting to see how many kinds of writing he's trying to get in to this work.
And it's interesting that this would be a sort of artisanal, one-off sort of production, whereas this is Picasso's own version of what would presumably be a mass-produced label.
Right.
So you've got this sort of weird interweaving of different modes of mark making and reproduction at different levels. It's not this sort of simple bifurcation between mechanical reproducibility on the one hand and the artisanal on the other side.
It also kind of, I think, points up that difference that you were indicating between, say, mechanical and the hand of the artist when they're doing exclusively, it's simply the subjective hand of the artist. So it's interesting that when he takes something that's, mechanically reproduced, it's actually reinscribing his own hand, right, in the mechanical, which is essentially kind of what that is what he's doing with the Kahnweiler cliche, right? Reinscribing. Right. So, did anybody else have comments?
In such a complicated way.
I love this stuff.